The guns had fallen silent, but peace had not come. Europe in 1919 was a continent scarred and broken, its cities in ruins, its people hollowed by grief. The First World War had ended, but the victory felt like ashes. Empires that had ruled for centuries, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, had collapsed, leaving behind confusion and resentment. Amid this wreckage, the victors gathered in Versailles to redraw borders and build what they hoped would be a safer world. But what they truly built that year was the seedbed of another, even greater catastrophe. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to end war forever. Instead, it planted the anger that would fuel the next one. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, stripped of colonies, forbidden to maintain a large army, and burdened with impossible reparations. The once proud nation found itself humiliated, its economy collapsing under the weight of debt, its people starving and bitter. In beer halls and streets, whispers of betrayal and revenge began to grow louder. A generation that had seen its empire torn apart wanted redemption, and somewhere, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler listened to their rage and began to turn it into fire. While Germany nursed its wounds, across the world, other nations too were growing restless. The 1920s were called the decade of peace, but it was an uneasy one. The League of Nations, formed to prevent another war, was powerless against ambition. The global economy staggered toward recovery, and yet underneath the calm, discontent festered. In Italy, war veterans returned home to poverty and chaos. Benito Mussolini, a man who spoke of glory and empire, rose to power, promising to make Italy great again. In Japan, the rising military elite began to look at Asia and see opportunity, resources, land, and power waiting to be taken. The New World Order built after 1919 was fragile, and it depended on the belief that nations would obey treaties, respect borders, and choose peace. But not everyone believed in peace. The nations that felt wronged by Versailles, Germany, Italy, and Japan, saw the world not as a place of cooperation but as a stage of conquest. They believed strength, not law, was the path to survival. They began to rebuild their armies, glorify war, and justify expansion as their destiny. This was the rebirth of militarism, and it would soon transform global politics into a battlefield of ambition. In Germany, the resentment of Versailles became a weapon. The Weimar Republic, a weak democratic government, struggled to survive under constant pressure. Hyperinflation destroyed the economy. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1921 cost billions by 1923. People carried money in wheelbarrows and burned currency for heat. Every humiliation, economic, political, emotional, was blamed on the traitors who had signed the peace treaty. Out of this chaos, Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party began to gain followers. His words were simple and venomous: Germany had been stabbed in the back, the nation needed to rise again. When Hitler attempted a coup in 1923, the beer hall putsch had failed, but his trial made him a national figure. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision of conquest: destroy the Versailles system, rebuild Germany's military, and expand eastward to create Lebensraum, living space for the German people. It was a manifesto of expansionism disguised as patriotism, and while many dismissed it at the time, it was the clearest warning the world would ever get. Meanwhile, in Japan, the winds of militarism were gathering strength of their own. The 1920s had brought democracy and modernization, but also frustration. Japan's population was growing rapidly, and the country lacked natural resources like coal and oil. Many Japanese leaders believed their nation's survival depended on expansion into nearby Asia. The army began to gain influence over the civilian government, pushing a nationalist agenda. Propaganda celebrated the divine destiny of Japan's emperor and the superiority of the Japanese race. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, crippling exports and throwing millions into poverty, the military saw its chance to seize control. In Europe, the Depression struck with equal force. The fragile democracies of the post-war era began to collapse under economic pressure. Fear and anger once again became the most powerful political tools. In Germany, unemployment soared to 6 million. The middle class, destroyed by inflation, turned desperate. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party's message of national revival, anti-communism, and revenge found a massive audience. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became chancellor. Within months, he dismantled the democratic system, outlawed opposition parties, and began building a totalitarian state. The rearmament of Germany, forbidden by Versailles, started in secret. The world watched but did nothing. At first, Hitler moved cautiously. He knew Germany was not yet ready for open conflict, but he also knew that the victors of the First World War, Britain and France, were exhausted, afraid of another bloodbath. They talked of peace, signed pacts, and preached diplomacy, while Hitler planned war. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, began training a new army, and filled the skies with warplanes disguised as civilian aircraft. He called it self-defense. In truth, it was preparation. Across the Mediterranean, Mussolini was doing much the same. He had turned Italy into a fascist dictatorship by 1925, crushing dissent and glorifying military power. His dream was to restore the Roman Empire, to dominate the Mediterranean and Africa. In his speeches, he declared that peace is a lie invented by the weak. Under him, Italy rearmed, invaded small territories, and tested the limits of the League's patience. No one stopped him, and that silence would echo years later when Hitler followed the same path. By the early 1930s, the world was standing on a fault line. The balance of power was tilting toward those who believed in expansion and force. In Germany, rearmament brought jobs and pride, and people who had once despaired now cheered Hitler's name. In Japan, generals planned the conquest of Manchuria, convinced that Asia's future belonged to them. And in Italy, Mussolini's speeches were filled with dreams of empire. Everywhere, the language of peace was fading, replaced by the language of strength. Yet the rest of the world remained in denial. Britain and France clung to the illusion that treaties and words could restrain aggression. The League of Nations, already weakened by the absence of the United States, issued statements of concern but no real action. It was as if the world had forgotten how quickly pride can turn into war. As 1933 drew to a close, Hitler stood on the balcony of the Chancellery in Berlin, watching the crowds chant his name beneath the swastika banners. In his mind, the future was already written. Germany would rise again, reclaim what was lost, and crush those who stood in its way. Far away in Tokyo, Japanese generals drew up plans to seize Manchuria, their soldiers already moving toward China's northern frontier. The Great War was supposed to have been the war to end all wars, but in the dark hearts of men hungry for power, it had only been an intermission. The next act of history was about to begin, and it would be written in fire. The first conquests, Manchuria and the Rhineland, 1931 to 1936. The world had barely begun to breathe after the Great War, yet already the tremors of a new storm were shaking the earth. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the nations were collectively holding their breath, unwilling to confront the rising tide of ambition. In the autumn of 1931, while the global economy reeled from the Great Depression, Japan's army struck at Manchuria. Unlike the sweeping, theatrical invasions that would later mark the Second World War, this campaign was calculated, cold, and precise. Soldiers moved under the pretense of protecting Japanese interests, but the true objective was clear: conquest, not defense. By the time the League of Nations issued a mild condemnation, the territory had already been absorbed into a puppet state named Manchukuo, a stark demonstration that military might, when combined with patience and planning, could bend the rules of the world without fear of serious reprisal. The invasion of Manchuria was not just an expansion of territory, it was a signal, a testing of the limits of international resolve. Japan's generals understood one unspoken truth: the Western powers, distracted by economic crises and political instability, would rarely intervene in affairs beyond their immediate borders. This realization emboldened them, and the machinery of militarism began to assert itself across the Pacific. Cities were fortified, industries restructured to support a war economy, and nationalist propaganda portrayed conquest as both a divine duty and an economic necessity. The ideology of aggression, framed as inevitability, began to spread like wildfire, leaving few in Japan willing to question the morality of expansion. Thousands of miles away, in Europe, another nation tested its own boundaries, slowly but deliberately challenging the international order. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had already begun the quiet rebuilding of its military. The Treaty of Versailles, with its restrictions on troops, tanks, and aircraft, had been a symbolic chain meant to prevent further aggression, but Hitler's engineers, planners, and generals ignored these chains. They trained secretly, devised strategies, and stockpiled arms while the world looked away. In March 1936, Hitler executed his first audacious gambit, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. German troops crossed the border into the demilitarized zone, an act explicitly forbidden by international treaties. For hours, Europe held its breath. Would France or Britain intervene? Would the world finally enforce the agreements painstakingly forged in Versailles? Yet no one moved. France hesitated, citing political instability at home. Britain debated moral principle against fear of another conflict. The League of Nations issued another empty statement, condemning the action without consequence. Hitler, observing from Berlin, realized a crucial fact: the era of unchecked ambition had begun, and the price of hesitation was often encouragement. The Rhineland, strategically vital and psychologically symbolic, became a fortress of German audacity, an early signal that the road to European domination could be paved with the indecision of others. The global stage, it seemed, had shifted overnight. Japan's actions in Asia and Germany's in Europe were not isolated events but twin harbingers of a new world order. In both cases, militarism and ideology glorifying force, hierarchy, and obedience supplanted diplomacy. Political leaders discovered that threats, when backed by credible military power, could reshape borders without firing a single shot in a full-scale war. The lesson was clear: might often outweighed right, and hesitation was a vulnerability the ambitious could exploit. For Japan, the conquest of Manchuria served another purpose beyond territory. It legitimized the military as the supreme authority in national politics. Civilian governments, once more powerful than the generals, found themselves subordinated to the army's objectives. Schools and newspapers became instruments of propaganda, teaching that the nation's destiny lay in domination of Asia. As the world grappled with economic depression, Japan's military leaders framed their expansionist vision as essential for survival. By portraying conquest as necessity rather than choice, they made the moral debate irrelevant, a dangerous precedent that would haunt Asia for decades. In Germany, the Rhineland achievement reinforced a similar narrative. The nation had been humiliated for more than a decade, yet now it could march into a forbidden region without opposition. Hitler's success demonstrated that diplomacy alone was insufficient to restrain ambition. He did not need war to achieve initial victories, he only needed courage, timing, and the observation that other nations valued peace over principle. The domestic response was electric. Germans saw their leader as a protector, a restorer of pride, and a strategist who understood both strength and opportunity. Militarism had become inseparable from nationalism, and the distinction between defense and aggression blurred. Meanwhile, other nations watched with a mixture of fear and disbelief. France, Britain, and the United States, still haunted by the cost of the First World War, believed that measured responses, negotiation, and patience would suffice. But the world was entering a new age, one where delay was equivalent to weakness. The Japanese in Manchuria and the Germans in the Rhineland were teaching an unspoken lesson: the world obeys those who act decisively, not those who deliberate endlessly. Inaction, in this era, was tacit permission to expand. The psychological impact of these first conquests cannot be overstated. For Germany, the Rhineland was both a testing ground and a morale booster. It demonstrated to Hitler's generals that the international community could be manipulated without firing a full-scale war. It showed the German people that humiliation could be reversed with a single bold decision. For Japan, the conquest of Manchuria validated militarism as the driving force of national policy. Both nations discovered that expansionism was not merely about acquiring land, it was about asserting identity, dominance, and perceived destiny. Even as they consolidated their gains, both countries laid the groundwork for future operations. Infrastructure, military bases, and propaganda campaigns ensured that Manchuria and the Rhineland would not merely be symbolic victories but stepping stones for larger ambitions. Germany began planning further incursions into Austria and Czechoslovakia, while Japan's military strategists turned their gaze toward northern China and eventually Southeast Asia. The world, distracted by economic collapse and political inertia, was unprepared for what was coming. By 1936, the era of unchecked militarism had been firmly established. Two nations on opposite sides of the globe had demonstrated the potency of calculated aggression. They had turned hesitation into opportunity and indecision into a tool for conquest. In both Berlin and Tokyo, the belief crystallized that the path to power was paved with bold, irreversible action and that moral authority, treaties, and international law were secondary to strength and strategy. The seeds planted in these early conquests would grow rapidly in the years ahead, drawing Europe and Asia inexorably toward the catastrophe that would engulf the world. Austria, Sudetenland, and the March Toward War, 1938 to 1939. The air in Europe had grown tense, charged with the weight of unspoken threats and the quiet steps of armies preparing to move. The world had watched Germany remilitarize the Rhineland and Japan seize Manchuria, but now the ambitions of Adolf Hitler were becoming unmistakably personal, deliberate, and dangerously public. By 1938, Hitler was no longer content to rebuild a nation or reverse the humiliation of Versailles quietly, he sought to redraw Europe itself. He sought not only power but the creation of a German empire that would dominate the continent. The first overt strike on this ambition came in the spring, targeting a nation many believed would never resist, Austria. Austria, small, divided, and politically fragile, was an easy target. Many Austrians shared ethnic ties with Germany, a fact Hitler used to justify his designs. The Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, was presented as a reunification of the German people rather than an act of aggression. German troops crossed the border in March 1938, encountering little resistance. Within days, Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich, and Hitler celebrated the event as a triumph of destiny over treaties. Europe watched silently. France and Britain, still haunted by memories of the First World War and hoping to avoid conflict, issued protests but took no action. The world's failure to intervene reinforced a chilling lesson: when strength is backed by decisive action, the hesitation of others is a green light for conquest. The Anschluss was more than a territorial expansion, it was a masterstroke of political theater. Crowds lined the streets of Vienna, waving flags and cheering troops, while Nazi propaganda portrayed the annexation as a popular demand fulfilled. Hitler understood the power of optics and sentiment, he framed aggression as inevitable, acceptable, even popular. This manipulation of perception, combined with careful military planning, would become a hallmark of his strategy in the years to come. Europe's silence emboldened him further, signaling that boldness, not diplomacy, was the currency of power. With Austria secured, Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia, a nation formed after the First World War and populated by ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland. Hitler exploited the grievances of these communities, portraying them as oppressed and in need of liberation. In reality, the Sudetenland was strategically vital, fortified with mountains, weapons, and industry that could significantly strengthen Germany's military capacity. Hitler demanded the territory, framing it as a question of self-determination for the German people rather than an act of aggression. The crisis of the Sudetenland escalated quickly. Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, convened the Munich Conference in September 1938. Here, the leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France made a fateful decision. They allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland without consulting Czechoslovakia, a nation being carved up without its consent. The policy of appeasement, meant to secure peace, instead rewarded aggression. Hitler left Munich triumphant, convinced that further demands could be made without fear of opposition. The Sudetenland was more than a land grab, it was a psychological victory, teaching the world and himself that hesitation could be exploited. By March 1939, Hitler abandoned even the pretense of caution. Having seized the Sudetenland, he moved to occupy the remainder of Czechoslovakia, this time without any claim of ethnic or historical justification. Bohemia and Moravia fell to German control, while Slovakia was transformed into a nominally independent puppet state. The invasion was swift, brutal, and complete, demonstrating that Hitler's ambitions were no longer constrained by diplomacy or logic. The world could no longer pretend these actions were defensive or justified. The illusion that Hitler's appetite for territory could be satisfied by small concessions had been shattered. These conquests revealed the core strategy that had been quietly forming since the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a combination of careful preparation, propaganda, and psychological manipulation, all supported by a military ready to act decisively. Germany's army and air force, once limited by the Treaty of Versailles, had grown into instruments capable of rapid territorial expansion. Hitler's generals learned to trust not only their own planning but also the predictably cautious response of Western powers. Strength, speed, and perception became the tools with which borders were redrawn without immediate consequence. The world outside Germany watched with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Britain and France, exhausted by the memory of the First World War, clung to diplomacy and moral appeals, believing that negotiation could restrain aggression. Yet Hitler's actions revealed that these nations had underestimated both the scale of his ambition and the efficiency of his methods. Appeasement, intended to preserve peace, had paradoxically accelerated the march toward war, demonstrating that concessions could embolden rather than pacify. Meanwhile, Hitler's conquests had domestic consequences as well. The annexations created a sense of national unity and pride in Germany, reinforcing Hitler's personal authority. Newspapers celebrated the victories, schools inculcated loyalty to the regime, and dissent was silenced. Militarism and nationalism, intertwined, became a self-reinforcing cycle. The more territory was gained, the stronger the regime appeared, and the more willing the population became to support further aggression. This fusion of ideology and action would make compromise increasingly difficult in the coming years. The Sudetenland crisis also highlighted the failure of international institutions. The League of Nations, which had failed to stop Japan in Manchuria and Germany in the Rhineland, was powerless once again. Resolutions were issued, speeches made, but there was no enforcement. This impotence sent a dangerous message: treaties, principles, and collective security were only as strong as the willingness of nations to act. Aggressors could calculate that decisive moves would meet with hesitation, and that hesitation was enough to guarantee success. As 1939 approached, Europe stood on the edge of a precipice. Hitler had taken Austria and Czechoslovakia with little resistance, each conquest reinforcing his sense of invincibility. Military plans were already being drawn for the next stage. Poland, a nation with deep historical significance and strategic value, would be the ultimate test of the Western powers' resolve. Meanwhile, the lessons of the past 6 years were clear: unchecked militarism combined with expansionist ideology, when paired with the timidity of other nations, could reshape borders and rewrite history with alarming speed. History was no longer a matter of treaties or negotiations. It was now defined by action, perception, and the calculated use of force. Hitler's strategy had transformed from rhetoric into reality, and each new conquest had a dual purpose: to strengthen Germany materially and psychologically, and to demonstrate to the world that hesitation was an invitation to domination. By absorbing Austria and Czechoslovakia, Hitler had not only expanded German territory but also shifted the balance of power in Europe, signaling that the continent's fragile peace was an illusion easily shattered by ambition backed with military precision. By the end of 1938, the stage was set. Germany had proven that boldness could outmatch diplomacy, that militarism could overpower treaties, and that expansion could proceed without immediate consequence. Hitler's confidence soared, while Europe's leaders debated morality and caution. The lessons of Manchuria, the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland were painfully clear. Ambition, when executed decisively, was rarely checked by hesitation alone. The world's failure to act decisively had allowed a dictator to grow stronger with each conquest, edging ever closer to the war that now seemed inevitable. The final step, Poland and the outbreak of World War II, 1939. September 1939 did not arrive quietly, it thundered in like a storm that had been brewing for years. The tensions in Europe, once whispers of ambition and cautious maneuvering, now crystallized into an unavoidable confrontation. Germany, emboldened by the ease with which it had swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia, turned its gaze eastward. Poland, with its fertile lands, strategic location, and historical disputes with Germany, became the next irresistible prize. Adolf Hitler did not conceal his intentions. This was not merely a campaign of expansion, it was the opening salvo of a war he intended to dominate. The months leading up to the invasion were marked by meticulous preparation and calculated deception. Germany forged the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. Beneath the surface, it contained secret clauses dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, granting Hitler the assurance that the Soviet Union would not intervene when German forces moved into Poland. This pact was a masterstroke of diplomacy as ruthless as any battlefield maneuver. Hitler had secured his eastern flank without firing a shot, illustrating the evolving sophistication of aggression in this new era of militarism. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. This was blitzkrieg lightning war executed with terrifying efficiency. Tanks rolled forward in precise formations, aircraft bombed key cities and military installations, and infantry followed in coordinated waves. The objective was rapid domination. Poland was to be overwhelmed before it could fully mobilize. Unlike the slow, grinding conflicts of the past, this was war reimagined fast, brutal, and designed to paralyze both enemy and observer alike. Within days, entire regions of Poland were under German control, the nation's infrastructure disrupted, its command centers targeted, and its morale shattered. Poland's response, valiant though it was, could not match Germany's precision. Soldiers fought bravely, cities resisted, and civilians endured unimaginable hardships, yet the speed and coordination of the German advance rendered conventional defense almost impossible. By September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling the secret provisions of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland, caught between two powers, was carved up, demonstrating that militarism and strategic cunning could nullify alliances and treaties faster than diplomacy could respond. The invasion of Poland marked a turning point, not just geographically but psychologically. Europe could no longer pretend that Hitler's ambitions were limited or negotiable. Britain and France, which had so long pursued appeasement and cautious diplomacy, finally recognized that inaction had failed. Declarations of war were made on September 3, 1939, but the world quickly realized that these announcements, while symbolically important, were insufficient to prevent immediate conquest. Poland's fall was a brutal lesson. Bold aggression, when combined with strategic deception and rapid military execution, could outpace the moral outrage and delayed response of the international community. The blitzkrieg strategy demonstrated the terrifying evolution of modern warfare. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry worked in seamless coordination to paralyze enemy defenses before they could react. Communications technology allowed commands to flow instantly across front lines, while propaganda ensured that civilian populations were demoralized even as armies advanced. Germany had transformed military power into an instrument not only of conquest but of psychological domination, ensuring that fear and confusion multiplied the effectiveness of physical force. The conquest of Poland would set a precedent that would echo throughout the entire conflict to come. Beyond the battlefield, the invasion had profound political consequences. Hitler's actions shattered the illusion that treaties and international law could contain his ambitions. Nations that had relied on collective security found themselves powerless, witnessing the rapid collapse of a sovereign state despite formal guarantees. The League of Nations, already weakened by prior failures in Manchuria, the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, was irrelevant. The moral authority of global institutions was exposed as fragile when confronted with swift, decisive militarism. The world was entering an age where might dictated outcomes faster than debate, and Poland's devastation became the unmistakable proof. Civilians suffered immeasurably. Cities like Warsaw endured relentless bombings, leaving countless dead and wounded, while families fled the chaos of advancing armies. Refugees streamed across borders, bringing the human cost of aggression into stark relief. For many in Europe, the horror of modern mechanized war became undeniable. The psychological impact on both occupied populations and neighboring nations created fear, resentment, and urgency, shaping the alliances and strategies that would define the coming years of conflict. The invasion also revealed Hitler's strategic genius, terrifying as it was. He had studied every potential weak point in Polish defenses, exploited geopolitical divisions, and combined diplomacy, deception, and force into a coherent plan that achieved rapid success. Poland fell not merely because of military superiority but because Germany had mastered the art of anticipating reaction or lack thereof from other powers. This comprehensive approach would serve as a blueprint for the early stages of World War II, demonstrating that modern warfare was as much about planning and perception as it was about sheer firepower. As the smoke cleared over Polish cities, it became clear that the world had changed irrevocably. Hitler had not only conquered territory, he had rewritten the rules of engagement. The lesson was unmistakable: hesitation and indecision were vulnerabilities to be exploited, while bold, coordinated action could overwhelm both defenses and diplomacy. The invasion signaled the end of the interwar period, the fragile decade when the world had hoped treaties, morality, and international bodies could prevent conflict. With Poland's fall, the illusion of peace shattered, and the full-scale global war that many had feared but few had anticipated had begun. By the end of September 1939, Europe was engulfed in a reality it could no longer ignore. Germany had proven that modern warfare could achieve near-total objectives in days rather than years, that strategic deception could neutralize potential adversaries, and that aggression rewarded by inaction would only embolden further ambition. For the first time in decades, the world witnessed that a single nation, when armed with vision, coordination, and ruthless determination, could alter the political and geographic map of Europe almost overnight. The outbreak of World War II was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of calculated actions, testing boundaries, and exploiting hesitation. Japan's campaigns in Asia and Germany's campaigns in Europe had demonstrated that militarism combined with expansionist ideology would go unchecked unless directly confronted. Poland's invasion was the final spark, igniting a war that would soon draw every continent into its orbit, unleashing unprecedented destruction and reshaping the global order forever. The stage for the deadliest conflict in human history had been set, and there was no turning back.